Well, good evening, and welcome to Live at the Library and a preview of the new Library of Congress and C-SPAN series, Books That Shaped America. My name is Peter Slen, and I'm with C-SPAN's Book TV. Well, about 150 years ago, when I was young, my parents were a little worried that my brother and I weren't reading enough. So they consulted Marion Stover. She was the principal at our grade school, Glenwood Elementary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And Miss Stover, as we called her, had two pieces of advice for us. Number one, let them read anything they want. The back of a cereal box, the words on a television commercial. Go to the library regularly and check out books. The second piece of advice was for bedtime. Let them stay up a half hour later, as long as that half hour was devoted to reading. Well, for some reason, that advice stuck. From reading cereal boxes, to book TV, to interviewing authors, and now to our new series, Books That Shaped America. We're going to begin the series September 18th. It's a Monday night at 9 p.m. It'll be live on C-SPAN. And we're going to kick off with Thomas Paine, who wrote down the frustrations early Americans were feeling. From there, we're going to go to Lewis and Clark, who explored and cataloged the unknown. Zora Neale Hurston, who helped to define the Harlem Renaissance and to vocalize the fears that many were feeling during that time. And to Milton Friedman, who defined the economic system that drives us. Now, these are just some of the authors and books that we'll be exploring in our 10-week series beginning September 18th. Books are meant to engage, enlighten, enrage, and energize us. And that's what we're hoping to do with the Books That Shaped America series. Now, the 10 books that we've chosen for this series represent different eras, topics, and viewpoints. They're derived from a larger list of 100 books created by the Library of Congress. And if you like the sublist that C-SPAN has chosen, thank the Library of Congress for their 100 books that shaped America. And if you don't like our editorial choices, blame C-SPAN and share your own list with us. There's a couple of ways of doing that. The website for doing that is at cspan.org/books that shaped America. You can also see a complete review of the entire series there. Plus, if you're here in the audience and you hear some books that you agree with or don't agree with, go downstairs. We have a video kiosk set up where you can record your own thoughts about books that shaped America. Well, I've mentioned three of my literary heroes, my parents and the estimable Miss Stover. And now I get to introduce two more. They'll talk about books that shaped America, perhaps share some of their own choices as well. One of my favorite moments at the National Book Festival every year is when I get to sit down with the Librarian of Congress herself to talk books. We forget the cameras are there, I think she does too, and we just start riffing about current and favorite books, and to the consternation of many, we forget what time it is, and we always go over our allotted time. Carla Hayden is only the 14th Librarian of Congress in our 247-year history, first and only woman. She's been in that position, since 2016. Now, I will tell you that her mother, Colleen, is a big C-SPAN watcher, and she is watching tonight. She's a big reader, and she'll be watching tonight, so play nice. Joining Dr. Hayden is best-selling historian and presidential biographer Doug Brinkley. You may be familiar with his presidential biographies, his books on Hurricane Katrina or the space race, and many other topics, but I want to mention his 1993 Magic Bus book. That book led directly to the C-SPAN bus, which for 25 years plus traveled the country educating students and schools, thousands, on civic education. One more reminder this evening, as with many C-SPAN programs, this will be interactive. You will have the chance to question Drs. Hayden and Brinkley by the note cards that will be passed out, and you can submit those if you have questions for them this evening. Now here's Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, and presidential biographer Doug Brinkley talking about books that shaped America.
Well, thank you, Peter. And it is a joy at the National Book Festival to spend time just talking about books, and they do have to give us the hook. So you're right. And I was so glad you also mentioned that C-SPAN selected the 10 books.
They did, so don't write the Library of Congress.
No.
The idea that C-SPAN, working with Library of Congress, has is just start talking about books that matter. And these are 10 to get us going. You know, everybody has one they wish, or many they wish were on the list. Mine would have been Henry David Thoreau's Walden, because of the environmental component with that book, but it's impossible. So I think we've got a good list and really interesting variety that covers the span of American history.
So with this partnership, and Peter mentioned it, I have to ask you, what books shaped you as a historian that we know today?
You know, one that really moved me was John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, where he called Route 66 the road of flight. And I remember reading that book when I was young, and his description of the Okies migrating to California after the Dust Bowl just ravaged the Great Plains. And, you know, the idea of an automobile, where some people were enjoyed going down Route 66, these people were packed, the Joad family packed in a vehicle. And then he would describe the migrant camps. And after I read that, Grapes of Wrath, it stays with me. I've reread it, and I tended to like novels more than history books, but usually U.S. writers. And I went through a Steinbeck phase where I read all of his, and then also Langston Hughes, who I love so much. You know, I Wonder as I Wander, and some of his autobiographical books I got to early. I have the collected Langston Hughes above my bed because they've done a multiple volume of all his papers, and it's really interesting. Those are just two of obvious many.
That stick out for you?
They stick out. I mean, I used to go through phases, Carla, where I'd read all of one author. I try to, like, if I read one book and I liked it, I would go. But David McCullough and I had talked about this. He loved novels, too, as a form of thinking of American history. So if I grew up in Ohio, if I want to think about what book about Ohio do I like, it tends to be Winesburg, Ohio, by the novelist Sherwood Anderson, not necessarily a biography of Rutherford B. Hayes, even though I'm a presidential historian, because oftentimes novelists can get into the tone and tenor of your time and bring you in to feel what it was like. And some of the books on our list, particularly Zora Neale Hurston, is one that does that. It brings you there.
So you've written recently about Rosa Parks, the space race, the national parks. I have to ask you, too, as a librarian, what's your process when you select those topics?
When I was young, I got to know Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the famous Kennedy biographer of 1,000 Days, and he helped me get involved with different things in New York. And he once told me, I was worried that I liked presidential history, military history, foreign policy, but also music, pop culture. And he said, just be a 20th century historian. There are 19th century British historians. There are 17th century Italian historians. You could look at the entire 20th century. And the great novelist Thomas Wolfe, I used to talk a line that there are 1 billion forms of America, that where this country where there are all these subcultures that are going around. And I wanted to learn about those. But also, you want to do a book that somebody else hasn't done. When I did Rosa Parks, there wasn't a mature biography written on her, and I approached Mrs. Parks about it, and with Elaine Steele, her assistant, they were hoping it would be an African-American woman that would write the book. And they told me that. But then soon after, they called and said, "Oh God, you're here. You want to do it?" And they brought me in totally.
So you transformed.
So yeah, and then the national parks, writing on Theodore Roosevelt's Outdoors and FDR and Rachel Carson. And I just love, when I was young, my parents were teachers, and we had a trailer station wagon. We got to go all over the United States and visit history sites and parks. And so it still stays with me. If I had to have a perfect job, it would be running something that takes care of historical sites. I'm a American history preservationist at heart, hence our symbiotic friendship.
I could see you as a park ranger. I could see it.
I wanted to be one of the isolated parks, like Arches in Utah or something, and just watch the seasons for a while. But I keep my eye on the public lands.
Well, let's look at the list. Now, this is C-SPAN's list. We keep emphasizing that. And don't forget the video booth. It's here at the Library of Congress until November 20th, and you can give your suggestions. But if you have to pick 10 to start, this is the start of the conversation. You mentioned something when we were just coming on. You said, number one, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, is still the best-selling book by an American author?
Yeah, it is, because it got published in January 1776, it has the advantage of being around the longest.
All right.
But it was taught forever. It's really a foundational document. I mean, it's just like we talk about the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. In many ways, Common Sense, that you can't think about America without reading it, because it was a 47-page pamphlet and released right at the beginning of the American Revolution, and it's electrifying to read now because Paine writes with such grace, and he's a provocateur, and he has the ability to get your emotions to rise. And what he was promoting was basically breaking away from Great Britain, that we needed to create the United States, and that monarchies were a thing of the past, and the United States was the place that had the creation of the U.S. was possible, and we would become a citadel of democracy. And so you never go wrong reading it. That's one book that, if you're going to pick one of the two of that period, Paine had come over to America from England, where he was from, right before the battles of Lexington and Concord. But Ben Franklin had kind of recruited him as in many ways, he was a bomb-throwing pamphleteer. And Common Sense ended up being in all the newspapers. And you couldn't go into a tavern or business establishment in 1776 in the new United States without Thomas Paine coming to people's lips, at least once it was identified that he was the writer behind it.
So he went viral.
He went viral.
Okay.
He went viral, and he stayed viral ever
1776.
since. And a great historian, Eric Foner, wrote a great book about Thomas Paine's America, which I read when I was young, and just loved it. And Paine is a endurable figure if you care about freedom and justice and democratic equality, and why potentially our system of government should be the envy of the world.
And then you get to the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Talk about a group.
Well, their justification, they were ratifiers. They wanted to ratify the Constitution after it was drafted, and basically you had to sell it to the American people. And the three authors, the lead one was Alexander Hamilton. And if you go through all of in the Federalist paper, when it came out, it became known as the Federalist. It becomes in the 20th century really called the Federalist Papers. But the point that they were really trying to make clear, for example, Hamilton's Federalist Paper number 78 was about the judicial department. And if you read it today, it's in all of the arguments that we're dealing with on court television and all, is thinking about what would be a Department of Justice, what would a judicial department be like, how can you do such a, create such an entity. And lawyers quote it all the time, and you'll have people that, the problem with, so he was the main writer. Alexander Hamilton wrote the most, followed by James Madison, and John Jay in the end did like 5 of them. But you will have people all the time quoting from the Federalist Papers trying to say, here's what the founders thought. It can be misused. They were trying to ratify the Constitution and writing these, but people say these are the original intents of the founders. So it depends how you read the Federalist Papers in today's 21st century legal system, and what how you're going to interpret. And each one's a little different than the other.
Would it be helpful for people to really get into it now?
I use that word foundational document, and there's no way you can really understand the United States without the Federalist Papers, period. I mean, because Thomas Paine, you could have maybe done something like the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, may have served a purpose, but with Federalist, it truly is founding documents. I mean, it's fundamental to read those and understand that. Unfortunately, Carla, we've kind of downgraded teaching of civics in high schools, teaching of government. So for any teacher to try to get students to weigh into the Federalist Papers in the vision of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay had for what our country can be it's a gold standard.
And the Library of Congress has Thomas Jefferson's copy.
I think that's cool.
It is so cool.
With
imagine his annotations. I mean, it is
annotated copy of it.
Federalist, and he puts who he thinks, and this whole thing about who did number 2 or number 70 and all of that.
Well, it became a little bit like there used to be he just died this year, Robbie Robertson of the group The Band, and people used to say who sang which vocal on these band albums. It was that way with the Federalist Papers for a while. Who wrote that? They didn't, they weren't trying to boast of authorship. They were trying to put together a collection of essays, and so they were united in purpose.
So did that ever get solved?
Yeah, I think there will be some people that debate who wrote. Did somebody else write a hunk of one? And but we pretty much know.
Okay, we'll look that up.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of Thomas Jefferson, the next book, The History of the Expedition Under the Command of Captains Lewis and Clark by Meriwether Lewis and John Clark. Now, Thomas Jefferson, as president, commissioned this exhibition. Yeah,
and the book you don't want on your 10 of that, Jefferson wrote a terrible book, I call it, Notes on Virginia, which is really a kind of racist, bigoted tract Jefferson wrote. So we have to deal with Jefferson's slavery in that aspect. The Lewis and Clark shows the side of Jefferson that's brighter, which is his thought of Western expansion. And while other politicians of the era, early 1800s, saw the Mississippi River as the end of the United States, we'd go from Atlantic to Mississippi. Jefferson was unique, really, in thinking it goes all the way to the Pacific. And he commissioned Meriwether Lewis and Clark, William Clark. We now know of recent years that some people will say Pittsburgh was where they convened, but basically they're going up the Missouri River, across the Continental Divide to Astoria, Oregon, Lewis and Clark. They keep these minute, brilliant, detailed journals, because Lewis was a naturalist par excellence, and he was dealing with different fern plants, seeing a different bird never seen before, documenting, interacting with indigenous people that nobody knew who lived there. Sacagawea becomes a big part of that core of discovery. But the journals are golden for their detailed scientific observations. The tragedy is they were kind of dispatched not for science, but also, was there a shortcut to trade to China? And they had to come back and tell Jefferson, no, the Rocky Mountain region's too rare. There's no way that we're going to be able to go quickly and use the Pacific to a gateway to China. And Meriwether Lewis, who wrote the best parts, in my opinion, Clark people will write in and defend Clark's writing. But I think Lewis's, he was depressed after it. It was a huge success. People didn't die from a military exploration expedition, highly successful. But he committed suicide, Lewis, in the Natchez Trace. He was depressed after it, and he felt that it had been a failure because there was no shortcut to China. There was no big economic, it was a wilderness out there. And, depression, he started doing opium and drinking and took his own life. Well, William Clark goes on and lives a robust life out of St. Louis, but gets more involved with what they used to call Indian affairs. And, his history, when you get into post Lewis Clark expedition, gets thorny on a lot of historical issues.
I wondered about the indigenous peoples that they encountered.
And they convince a leader to come all the way to Washington, D.C. to be here. Jefferson, it gets forgotten, and this is a book that could have, a man named Zebulon Pike wrote the Pike journals. Same time, Jefferson's saying, what do we got out there? And the key is, right, everybody, I mean, he bought the Louisiana Territory. Jefferson had sent James Monroe, future president, and Robert Livingston, the great New York City real estate business entrepreneur, to buy just New Orleans from Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had setbacks in Haiti. He was concerned about the growth of the British power. And to the surprise of his diplomats, Monroe and Livingston, he offered them the whole Louisiana Territory to the United States, partially because Jefferson was a Francophile, loved everything about France, and the French people loved him. And in the end, Napoleon decided he would rather have the Louisiana Territory be in American hands than British or Spanish. And overnight, Jefferson doubles the size of our country. And so it's Lewis and Clark going out to see what's going on, but also you have Zebulon Pike. And Pike went up the Mississippi River all the way looking for the headwaters of the Mississippi. He misdiagnosed it. He chose Lake Cass in Minnesota when it's Lake Itasca, where our nation's great river begins. But when Pike went up there, he was claiming modern-day Iowa and Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota for the United States, because Britain was in, of course, Canada, and a second war with Britain was looming, which exploded with the War of 1812. And then Pike went and found the headwaters of the Arkansas River, the Red River. He went all the way to Santa Fe, and Spanish authorities confiscated his diaries and journals and put him in jail, Pike. And Jefferson was threatening war if you didn't release the journals. They get published a decade before Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike's journals on Western exploration, and he misdiagnosed beyond something besides the headwaters of the Mississippi, but he said modern-day Nebraska is essentially a great desert where nothing will ever grow. And it's the breadbasket of America.
I think we'll get some comments about that.
And then Pikes Peak in Colorado is named after him from the journal Seeing That Mountain, the first Euro-American to document seeing that. He went on to serve Pike as a brigadier general in the War of 1812 and was killed at the Battle of York. York is the modern-day Toronto. And he's buried there in Canada, but there's a movement to exhume him and bring his body to Colorado to be on top of Pikes Peak. After Washington, more things were being named after Zebulon Pike than anybody else.
Really?
Yeah, he was the first kind of new wave hero after the American Revolution because of his exploits in westward expansion.
And I have to ask you, where are the journals?
Who?
The journals.
The Library of Congress.
Now, I really didn't know that.
Get me to say
no, I really did not know that. Scouts honor. My mom is watching, so she knows.
They're worth looking at too. The Pike journals. Yeah. They're published.
One of the things that I talk about a lot relates to literacy. And the fourth book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave by Frederick Douglass, is a 1945 memoir. And the reason why I know that one so well is his chapter on learning to read.
It's unbelievable, and how important the narrative of Frederick Douglass was. Everybody must read that book. That's quintessential reading. But born into slavery, Frederick Douglass, and writes with vivid description of the horror of enslavement and beatings of that Black Americans took, and then he's lucky he got to your town, Baltimore, where he did start learning to read and write. And Douglass would later say, that the white power structure, slave owners, were trying to prevent slaves from learning how to read and write because books became empowerment.
Right.
Well, Douglass became a brilliant intellectual. He not only gave the best lectures of his era, some of the well-meaning abolitionists like Garrison and Wendell Phillips, they used to want to kind of prop him up as an anti-slavery voice. Once that narrative came out, he was on his own, Frederick Douglass. He was selling out houses. When the book got published, he went to Ireland and England. He became a global sensation. And of course, Frederick Douglass has such a rich history in America. And I'm glad our country's catching up to his legacy. Here in D.C., you have his home at Anacostia, run by the National Park Service, a really great site to tour. And scholarship on Frederick Douglass has really kicked in. David Blight of Yale University and others have written recently authoritatively about Douglass. And, people find interesting his relationship to Lincoln. But that narrative reads so powerfully today that it gets you into the belly of the beast of slavery, where Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin could be one of the important books. Certainly it was at the time. But it doesn't read in the same way that Frederick Douglass's narrative does, in the sense of really the descriptions of what it was like from being enslaved and then getting to be free and be emancipated. It's a remarkable book.
And his quote that is used quite often after he describes the fact that he knew that this reading and what's in these books has to be important because he was forbidden to learn how to read and could be punished. And he said, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free.
And how do you beat a line like that? It's books are the windows to the world, and the Library of Congress, we're here at the center of it, and Washington, Baltimore area is really elevating Frederick Douglass. If you're in New York, the New York Historical Society has a statue of Douglass in front, and he's really one of the true sustainable heroes in of America's past.
And another book that's been published recently about Frederick Douglass is Picturing Douglass, because he was the most photographed American ever.
Oh, and it's so fascinating. Not only was he photographed, he became a huge celebrity. I mean, Lincoln was, excited to be with Frederick Douglass or to see him, and he would fill up lecture halls. People would be packed in to encounter him. And there's so many episodes leading into the Civil War where Douglass is center stage, but yet he met John Brown of Osawatomie, Kansas, and most famously of Harper's Ferry, of John Brown trying to seize a federal arsenal and hand out guns so enslaved people could revolt. And Douglass begged off of that. That was a bridge too far for him. But the people that loved Douglass were like Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott, the intellectual crowd of greater Boston area.
Louisa May's father.
Yes,
Alcott.
yes.
Well, we are physically next door to the Supreme Court, right here at the Library of Congress. And the next book, The Common Law by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., torts, property, contracts, crime, And Holmes says, the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. So why is this on this list?
I was surprised that he was on the list. Not that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. is not a giant, and I'll mention why, but I really hadn't ever read Common Law. It's become such a part of our culture, and we're the most legalistic society in the world, and his really boiling down thoughts about our legal institutions. That book is his distilled lectures and thinking down into a potent, little longer form essay, but you can read it pretty quickly. He was an extraordinary figure. I mean, mainly people maybe don't realize because Theodore Roosevelt put him to the Supreme Court, and he lived to be like 93 years old. He was the oldest Supreme Court justice. So when you hear, murmurs today, people should step down at 80 and things. He was 90 at the Supreme Court, but people were in awe of him in the 20th century because he had been a soldier. He had served in battlefield in the Civil War for the Union Army. He had actually got wounded and many times, and he was at places like Antietam and the Wilderness, and battle after battle. And so, if you were alive in, say, circa in 1910, to get to talk to Holmes about the Civil War and service, and he had a handlebar mustache. He was the ultimate Boston Brahmin. He had an eye always kind of on Great Britain. He was a deep intellectual, but he comes to the conclusion that the Constitution is a living document, and that's why the common law matters, that it has to be changed to meet the needs of different generations, that you can't claim something about a First or Second Amendment or Fourth from an era and interpret it with the founders, because he says the point of law is that human civilization gets better, and you don't cling to something. It's elastic, and each generation has to, if you like, upgrade the Constitution with amendments and the like. So he's a loved jurist, and anybody who goes to law school will learn stories and dissents, but mainly, Holmes is a legal giant.
Now, I have to say, it sounds like that's a book that we might need to revisit today.
I think it matters. No, the joy of C-SPAN picking these books is knowing I was going to be here. I had read it, and I've been teaching history a long time. I had the feeling if I had gone to law school, I probably would have encountered it in a more direct and important way, but it really opened my mind, because a lot of the things Holmes was involved with, you hear on pundits on TV all the time, like First Amendment, when you're, you can't scream, fire in a movie theater, and, what are the limits of the First Amendment, and the gun debate in the country today. Was that meant for militias of that period, or how does that justify semi-automatic, weapons being sold, willy-nilly at flea markets? But the point is that Holmesian thinking is that we need to constantly update our thinking to fit, because in the end, law is not punitive. Laws move, and the point of our Constitution, the genius of the experiment of the Constitution, is indeed in its ability to be meaningful to the generation that's alive at the time.
Now we know why this book was selected.
Yeah.
That answers that question. Also, I think there was a movie. I saw it on one of those classic movie things, The Magnificent Yankee.
I haven't seen that, so I'm afraid.
Well, I have to tell you why. So I love those things. And I'm watching this about Oliver Wendell Holmes in Boston, and he's at the end of his life, and he's in a chair like this, and there's a young law clerk, saying, "Sir, he had no children and everything." So he said he wanted to leave his resources, like $200,000, to the U.S. government, and the law clerk was like, "Oh, well, don't do that. to the government. He said, no, I'm going to do it. And then he leans back very dramatically and closes his eyes. And my books to the Library of Congress.
Oh, really?
I thought I woke up. I'm like, what? Because the Library of Congress has his collection right down the hall, the Oliver Wendell Holmes collection.
That's one of the great collections in U.S. history, keeping the Holmes, who was a great correspondent to people, less so of writing books. Other justices later will write books. William O. Douglas wrote like a book every 2 years, but Holmes really was distilling a judicial philosophy that he's imparted on our country, and it's very much alive today.
And the next book, so many of us had to read it, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, and the controversy about it too.
I think that book will always, it was born in controversy and will stay in controversy forever. It was born in controversy less really about the racial dynamics, which I'll mention in a moment, but just that he had young Huck and Jim, saying, playing dirty pranks and being a little bit immoral, or being, teenagers getting into trouble. And so for people that wanted, moral rectitude in a book, you weren't finding it in Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And at the time, it also has a real connotation on race, and in Twain's mindset of that era when he wrote it, that it was showing Huck and Jim coming from different kinds of oppression. In Huck's case, a mean father, and in Jim's case, growing up enslaved. But they become and forge a friendship and form a dynamic duo as they go down the Mississippi. Why it's controversial today, though, is because the N-word is used in it quite a bit, and some people want it banned because of the use of that, and say it can't really be a classic because of that. And then Twain was willing to do dialect, and anytime a white author starts dealing in dialects of any culture, it gets very tricky and sensitive, particularly now. Ernest Hemingway famously said, all American literature emanates from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So it continues to live on and be discussed and debated. And Twain is one of our, of course, great writers because of his body of work. But this was the one that is lasted the test of time and is still read and taught, but less so now.
Because of that.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting, and I'm skipping over to number 8, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, was also criticized for using dialect, and Alice Walker, the great writer, basically resurrected her and her reputation. And
on that, Zora Neale Hurston's really interesting American figure. I mean, she was born in the South, came north, educated at Barnard and elsewhere, and started doing ethnography and anthropological studies. And she wrote really well and had a great listening ear. And before long, starting like in the late 1920s, she was in the South collecting folk tales and folk stories. Well, these are irreplaceable if you're going to capture black culture in the South, because a lot of times they were, what was really going on in a black community. And she took on issues of racism in the South in her research and her writings, but she then evolved from a folk collector, which are invaluable. Her first book, I think, is called Men and Mules, and was nonfiction. It was folk compendium. But by the time she writes, her novel, it's really an important book because on dialect, guys, it's tricky. You're right. With Alice Walker not saving her or helping her reputation after Walker wrote The Color Purple and had great, acclaim, people didn't like the way that you're trying to capture the way black people speak in it. But it's a feminist manifesto. If you read the book, it's about women and men in general and how black women have to develop a fierce, independent spirit separate from men. And she writes that her character in the book was married 3 different times and had an abusive husband. And so in many ways, it's fascinating as a cultural document, but it's also a kind of women's liberation book in its own right. And she died broke, had no money in Florida, and nobody knew, she said, I'll die broke, yet her papers are now invaluable, and she's embraced in Florida full-heartedly as one of the great American writers and figures. And people will make the assumption, well, it's a black woman writing about of the African-American state of the South, but she wasn't a liberal, she wasn't an FDR person. She would vote Republican, and believed in a lot of self-reliance, a kind of a libertarian side going on with her too. So you don't want to put these people in little boxes. She's a full bore intellectual of great merit.
And that distrust of FDR at the time and Truman, I mean, she was pretty vocal about that.
Very vocal about it, and yet, she worked with Federal Writers Project. She appreciated some things about the New Deal, but she didn't find that to be a solution on dealing with race relations, that the federal government would allocate some monies or do something. It seemed to her, in her book, in her novel that was chosen, she does characters, fictional characters, one representing Booker T. Washington, kind of up from slavery. Some people called it accommodating, how to work with white America, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who was, the Harvard, superstar and wrote The Souls of Black People. And in Booker T. Washington's books, Up from Slavery, either of those, Du Bois or Up from Slavery, could have been picked as a top 10. But she does very cleverly in that book, presents both sides in the black community that she's writing about, that they're arguing within black society about these issues of which is the answer to do away, or do you do a personal Tuskegee Institute-like, build your own. White people will not do not need to integrate. We have our own culture and our own mores, and we develop that. Or do you fight like Du Bois with the NAACP and dissent and go on?
Law.
Du Bois won in the big sense of that battle, but Booker T. Washington is not to be underestimated, the importance when he was the leading the sage of Tuskegee.
And another woman that's on the list, Willa Cather.
Willa Cather.
My Antonia. I'm a Midwesterner, so,
Which I always think of you with Baltimore.
I know, because I live there, but Illinois.
What
Springfield.
You're Springfield, Illinois?
And Champaign, Illinois.
Wow.
And then farther south, places like, nobody's going to know this, DuQuoin, Illinois.
Well,
I heard a little bit.
I'll tell you,
Sparta.
By all means, people should go visit the Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield and visit Lincoln's tomb, and it's powerful. But also, now you can do a guided tour in Springfield of the so-called racial unrest of 1908, which was, we've been talking about Tulsa in 1921 recently, but Springfield in 1908 was quite a horrible racial incident there, and out of that was born the NAACP.
Yeah.
But I never associate you with Illinois, and now I will. I don't know.
Well, I've been in Baltimore for 30 years, so. But you always have the corn growing out of ears, and that's what the my Antonia and the Midwest, 1918. I mean, she captured it.
From here, you're in Virginia, Westchester, Virginia, but her family moved. And this is a smart choice by C-SPAN, I think, Willa Cather, because in My Antonia, not only is it a brilliantly written book, it's part of a Prairie trilogy that began with O Pioneers, and then My Antonia, and then the Songs of the Lark, and then My Antonia. So it's a trilogy. You could have picked any one of the three. I think C-SPAN picked the right one. But she's writing about growing up in the Great Plains in very brilliant way, deals with the killing of a rattlesnake or planting the crops, and dealing with European immigration to the Midwest and what it was like for pioneer families out there and how they had to rely on each other. And then also love interest stories where the the guy that, ends up leaving that she loved playing with because when they were young, but later in life they reconnect. So she's sort of an incredible figure writing about Red Cloud, Nebraska, and it brings My Antonia. Some people will argue it's the best written novel in American history if you're looking at it from a pure literary, stylistic, dialogue point of view. Cather, was living in Greenwich Village, New York at the time.
And you
Paine-
mentioned
Paine
that Thomas
died
Paine
there.
lived in Greenwich Village.
Yes.
Whoa, the village has always been hot, huh?
It's always been hot. And as a kid, I liked seeing all the plaques, who lived where. And so you can, if you get a guide, they'll show you where the Willa Cather house is, or where O. Henry lived, or where, Bob Dylan rode. And it's endless there at Greenwich Village. Probably after Concord, Massachusetts, at the start of our American literary intellectual life, and which includes Walden Pond, Greenwich Village, New York, has been such a hub, and Harlem, where the Harlem Renaissance, and Zora Neale Hurston was considered
Langston
part of
Hughes and all
that.
the whole group.
And those are two extraordinary literary milieus, the Village and Harlem.
And then, talk about timely. Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman. And I'm so glad that Rose is in there too, because you hear about him. Nobel Medal Prize, economist associated with the Chicago School. And if you could just let people know what the school was famous for.
Okay. Well, look, I was surprised I'm not surprised that Milton Friedman and his wife are part of this, but I never thought of it as a great book. But thinking longer about this, Milton Friedman has had a massive career that has mattered. If you want to understand the conservative movement of today, Milton Friedman and his wife they were a team. They're remarkable in that regard. The Chicago School, just limited time, but it did not believe in Keynesian economics. Did not believe in this, gathering debt or spend money later. And it did not believe that a good currency to help the dollar prevail should be a lot of federal expenditure. It was more about less government is more government. To the point when the Friedman did their book, it was right when Ronald Reagan was getting elected, and Reagan worshipped Milton Friedman, and he would call for things like abolishing of the Department of Energy that Jimmy Carter had just created, and abolishing Food and Drug Administration, and sizing down government. And he was very pure about that, in the sense that he was against the Iraq War because it's money, government getting us into something. He really was a laissez-faire, they were laissez-faire capitalist, and yet a brilliant economist. And this book they did for a TV show. So they wrote them in chapters, 10 chapters that are very readable to the public. So if you read it, it goes down easy. My problem with Friedman was that a lot of his economic books are quite complicated. In many ways, they went over my head.
Well, that's the Chicago School.
Yeah, and you'd have to study them. With this book, it's a distillation of that anti-federal regulatory philosophy, which continues to be very pervasive in our society. And when I pulled back and took a look at it, it makes sense that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was picked, and Milton Friedman. One's in dealing with law, the other economics, but they're kind of interesting partners in the sense that they look at the role of the federal government in American lives in different ways.
And then the 10th book, in terms of partners in that, The Words of Cesar Chavez.
Well, Cesar Chavez, the main thing to know about him is he's born in Yuma, Arizona. Some people make the mistake that thinks he was, migratory labor. He is an American citizen, and he was traumatized as a boy because his family during the Great Depression had the local banks seize their farms, seize their property in a very unseemly and frankly racist takeover of their family land. and it forced the Chavezes to become itinerants, going all over California picking produce and living in this squalor. And out of that experience, he kept talking about self-educating himself, reading Cesar Chavez, and ended up encountering Saul Alinsky's writings, who was a big Chicago, a thinker about how to create worker and poor people movements and how to have empowerment for those without wealth. And a man named Fred Ross, who was the genius organizer of labor in California. He adopted Cesar Chavez's Catholic Church, his Catholicism, the ceremony of the communion wafer. He would carry then on protest the crucifixion of Christ and bring in more and more Mexican Americans and Filipinos, working with certain progressive bishops into creating the United Farm Workers Union. And Carla, I'm going to get to interview Dolores Huerta, who was his partner. She's in her 90s at the Texas Tribune Festival in a week, and I'm very excited for that. So it's Cesar Chavez, his wife Helen, and Dolores Huerta are kind of the leadership of pointing what Steinbeck was pointing out in Grapes of Wrath, how horrible we treated humans as if they were just, animals, and no restrooms for pickers in the fields, beatings. In Bobby Kennedy, famously when he ran for president in 1968, came out to Delano in California to break the fast that Chavez was doing. He was not eating to protest the labor conditions, and Bobby and Ethel Kennedy were there to give him the communion wafer. But Chavez in California, they have a day for him, and all over the Southwest. I live in Austin, Texas, and our main thoroughfare is named after Cesar Chavez, and statues everywhere. And it's very important through Chavez and Dolores Huerta as figures to explain the Latino and particularly Mexican-American story in our country. So I could see why we needed to have if not that book, one that addressed that.
Very timely. And I understand that we have some time for a few questions, and we have gathered them. And before we start, though, I wanted to ask about Chavez. Was he an orator like Martin Luther King Jr.?
No, but Dr. King sent him a very important telegram telling him what they shared. King was the great orator. Chavez wasn't that comfortable of speaking. But Chavez delivered speeches with a genuine authenticity, and he had an aura about him that was remarkable. And a charisma is a word we can use for him. His followers continue to grow and grow and grow. But what King and Chavez shared, which was a bit unusual, was a fervent love and devotion to philosophy of nonviolence as written about by Mahatma Gandhi. Both are nonviolent Gandhian figures and led the most successful protest of the 60s and 70s, saying violence is never the answer. We will never resort to violence no matter what. And so you can study, when you study nonviolence movement in America, it emanates a nice history from the letter of civil disobedience that Thoreau wrote from jail when he wouldn't pay taxes for the Mexican-American War, civil disobedience down to Dr. King, and that also influenced Chavez. So it's all part and parcel of the cause of social justice, but nonviolence in achieving it.
And that authenticity is what came through.
Yes,
especially in that age.
And he was smart and handsome, and people just gravitated towards him. And once Time magazine put Chavez on the cover in the late 60s, Chavez was able to convince people here in Maryland, Virginia, not to eat grapes and go after a California.
Well,
not to eat produce from by a grower that had
thing.
Horrific conditions and wouldn't pay United Farm Worker Union laborers a proper living wage or proper work conditions. So important.
And from what I understand too, globalism was part of his. So you have the movement to keep things close in this country, but then his philosophy was much more international.
And the mistake people make about Cesar Chavez is he loved the United States of America very much. He had served in the Navy. He didn't have the greatest time in the Navy. It was a Jim Crow Navy where he was being a Mexican American, and he got in his first bit of police trouble, or John Lewis's good trouble, when he came on a leave from the Navy, Chavez, and went to a movie theater, and Mexican Americans had to sit in a certain section. He was on a date and sat at the regular place, and they took him to the police station. And so he had a fire in his belly about what's right and what's wrong, and a fierce sense of grit. I mean, anybody who can fast and not eat for days on a protest like he did, and then lead these marches to protest where his feet were all blistered and bleeding, and you have to soak them. And of course, Barack Obama, the grassroots organizing side of Barack Obama, he adopted the Huerta Chavez, yes we can, from Cesar Chavez. So there's a direct link to Obama to Huerta and Chavez.
Let's see. Wow. Well, we have questions.
Great.
And you can see, and before I'm going to have you talk about your books, though, especially the new one about climate. And
Well, my recent book is called Silent Spring Revolution. John F. Kennedy and Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson and Nixon are dealt with it, the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. But Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, came out in 1962, and that could have easily been on this top 10 list, because Rachel Carson, looking at DDT and pesticides that were developed after during World War II, and it were applied by crop planes spraying all these chemicals. She was arguing that people were getting sick from it, that it created cancer and leukemia spikes, and she took conservation or environmentalism and married it with public health. And so in her book is the birth of environmental justice issues, environmental health issues. And I write in my book, Silent Spring Revolution, about climate change, that in 1958 we were very clear on CO2 emissions. Kennedy, there's a memo, I doubt he read it, that deals with it. Lyndon Johnson mentioned it. But the shocker to me was former Nixon advisor Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was considered a Nixon House intellectual, wrote a memo to John Ehrlichman saying, I'm studying, talking to the weather people, the science people, and if this is all accurate, the data we're gathering, we are in big trouble. And he actually writes in the White House, goodbye Miami, goodbye New York. What happens to Seattle is unknown. And, so this is the Nixon era. And we've had a lot of presidents, and we've all been, the Al Gore moments of climate change, but here we are talking to you when it's been the hottest summer on record in so many places in the world and all across the United States. And climate issues are going to be living with us as front page news, I'm afraid, for the rest of our lives. It's a long-term problem.
this relates, and several of the questions are really pointing to something people want to hear you pick. If you were to pick a book from the 21st century to be on this list, what would you pick? Is there a book in recent history within the last 10 years? What do you think will be a classic? What authors or writers in the last 30 years? So you have to put a
Well,
you have to.
You know, I'm a little bit amazed that, guys, it's impossible to boil things down to 10, okay? It just is. There are hundreds, and hopefully this 10 leads to another 10, then another 10. Used to be you'd have to have Leaves of Grass of Walt Whitman's book of poetry,
Okay.
because he used to sing Our Great Chants of Democracy. And Whitman's gift was free verse, saying, you sing your own song, everybody here in the audience, you're your own poet. And you don't have to rhyme. Rhyming is a kind of disciplinary thing. You can just write what you feel and express yourself. And Whitman's free verse poetry through Leaves of Grass and the blues and jazz music that leads to rock and roll, but meaning Duke Ellington and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, and what jazz and spontaneity and the discipline of being a great jazz player, and how you can be an individual in jazz, but you're playing with a community of players to get a result. And these are our great gifts. I would say the writer who matters the most in recent times, in my mind, American writer, Toni Morrison. You can't now really be alive and not read, Tar Baby or Beloved and one of her novels. I happened to reread, I didn't read it properly, a book by David Foster Wallace called Infinite Jest. He committed suicide, but it's a powerful novel where he was looking at American popular culture and television and black humor, as he used to be called, dark humor, and a lot going on with David Foster Wallace. And he comes to mind. The real masters of book, in a American history way, as a professional historian, I'd be slighting so many historians, but I will say, Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, I think, is one of the great books of history. And the way very few people can have, if you know the Library of America, there are these beautiful books that have a black cover dust jacket, and it's sort of a pantheon of great American books. I could see Doris's No Ordinary Times about Franklin and Eleanor, and her book on Lincoln, Team of Rivals, as being sustainable history narrative classics in the tradition of Barbara Tuchman, who had written The Guns of August and all of that. And you're dealing with high praise when you're getting into Doris Kearns Goodwin and Tuchman territory.
Well, as a presidential historian, there had to be a question for you for this.
The big book this year for me is the Martin Luther King biography. Jonathan Eags wrote the ability to do King in a single volume in such a deeply readable but scholarly precision, where you can build King up, and at the same time you're leveling up, turning him into a human, not a sanctified figure. Hard to beat that book of his as a biography, and also his one on Muhammad Ali was really strong.
So, what past U.S. president was the most voracious reader? That's what people really
Well, the
want to
trick
know.
here is you got to say Jefferson. It's the Library of Congress, and he donated the Jefferson Library as the foundation. So I would put Jefferson high. Theodore Roosevelt read. He constant reading. He'd be up all night long. He had insomnia and would just pour through books. T.R. wrote like 35 books and 150,000 letters, but he read. And the book that I think influenced him a lot was Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species, which came out in 1859, right when his father was creating the American Museum of Natural History. And we probably take for granted what a revolution Darwin's book was on evolution from species and the Galapagos and all of that. But T.R. spoke multiple languages and could read books in French or German. And Jefferson, that classic line of John F. Kennedy's was there's at a dinner party at the White House that there were never that many brilliant people as tonight along the dinner table, except when Jefferson dined alone. and those two in my mind are the ones. And sometimes a writer can help a president along. I looked recently at Merle Miller. Harry Truman was not a great writer. He never graduated from high school. His memoirs are solid, but he was living a kind of ex-president's life in Independence, Missouri, without a lot going on with Vietnam War and civil rights, and there's Truman at his home. And a filmmaker named Merle Miller came right before he died and interviewed him, and it became called Plain Speaking. And in that book, you can hear as a storyteller, not a writer, Truman's sense of storytelling is remarkable. And just like Bill Clinton's ability to tell stories, it's different than the writing. It's just a remarkable way of putting bits of Americana together. And Truman was read deeply in American history, but he was not a literary type per se.
Well, I think we have to thank C-SPAN for selecting the list, and we can't wait to hear what other people are going to say. And I'm sure there are things being typed in right now that people are saying, what, you didn't mention this, you didn't mention that, but you have an opportunity to do it.
It's like those desert island discs where you pick your 10, you know, and no matter what, you're leaving the rest of the universe out.
Right.
And so if everybody's doesn't have, you know, bristles a little that their
Right.
book isn't on the list, it'd be doing something wrong. But I congratulate C-SPAN
Oh, yeah.
for doing this and getting us talking about books and partnering with the Library of Congress. And hopefully there are more of these events to come, and the list of 10 grows to 100.
And we have a gigantic book club. And we just all do it together. So it's time. So thank you, Doug.
Thank you so much.
So much for being here.